Another year, another season of Rick and Morty. That's what I thought upon seeing the trailer for Rick and Morty Season 6. Maybe it was coming from a feeling of fatigue, as it isn't very common for Rick and Morty to release a season one year after another. I know part of the fatigue definitely stemmed from my feelings on the last two seasons, both of which I felt were weak when compared to the seasons before them. Either way, I just wasn't very excited for this season. I didn't feel like giving my thoughts on the trailer, as it honestly didn't make me feel much of anything in particular. So I decided to wait until the middle of the season to see how things would play out. So now that the first 5 of the 10 episodes this season are out, how do I feel about it? To be honest, I'm pretty bored. Let me explain by jumping right into episode 1 before analyzing the season as a whole. So, episode 1, Solaris. This episode had the difficult task of wrapping up the pretty massive cliffhanger ending from the last season. So how did it manage that? Not bad, I suppose. Rick and Morty isn't really a stranger to making light of what seem like dire circumstances at first glance, but I guess the Space Beth Iron Man thing just didn't land for me. It wasn't an issue or anything, it's definitely a plausible way for them to escape, but the Avengers Endgame parallel just sort of fell on deaf ears, or maybe it's just because I'm sick of the MCU by now. A good thing about this situation being wrapped up so quickly is that it means the episode is quickly able to jump into its own plot, that being Rick, Morty, and Jerry being sent back to their realities of origin. Pretty cool premise to see, for one, knowing we were once again going back to the Cronenberg universe, C-137, as well as hopefully learning a bit more about Rick and Jerry's universes of origin. Although what we ended up getting was pretty cool, it felt a little underwhelming in a way. I've realized lately that I just don't find Beth very funny, and I've already expressed my hatred for Summer before, so the B-plot was just pretty boring to me. I don't know how common those sentiments about Beth and Summer are, but that's just how I feel at the very least. Their jokes just never really land for me, or they're just overly mean, which I'm not really a fan of. Rick actually returning to his universe was cool to see, as this is the first time we actually get to see it in person, not a simulation or a memory. The fact that Rick programmed the voice of his dead wife to haunt him is such a Rick thing to do. Stuff like that really helps sell just how much Rick really does hate himself, so while yeah, it's pretty sad and morbid, it's also really good characterization. Seeing C-137 again was also pretty neat, now even more dead and abandoned than when we saw it in Season 3 5 years ago. Morty running into Primal Jerry was also pretty cool, as seeing an actually competent Jerry is always rare. He's a lot more mellow than last time we met him, seemingly a bit more back in his senses. His presence was pretty minimal, however, only really showing up to steal Morty's stuff and then dip. We also learn in this episode that the Rick who killed Rick's family is actually Morty's original Rick. Honestly, a twist I was not expecting and quite liked. After encountering him, they make a quick escape while also throwing in some more nostalgia with the 100 years Rick and Morty comment. They show up saving Summer and the Beths, pick up Jerry from his admittedly boring universe, and go home. The whole Mr. Fundles thing was also pretty funny, kinda reminded me of the everything on a cob bit from Season 2. And that was it. Overall, not bad. Not the strongest season opener, but also not the weakest. Didn't get me hyped for the season, but also didn't send me running for the hills, so that was good. Pretty standard 7 out of 10, I'd say. Rick, a Mort Well Lived, has all the ingredients to be a pretty solid episode. Maybe not for me, considering Summer has a pretty big role in it, but typically if she's written to not be the worst person ever, she's fine. And in this one, I mean, she's alright. She's been worse. Her whole plot of sneaking around and, quote, doing a Die Hard is fine enough. Nothing too exciting though, just pretty generic action movie cliches. The real meat and potatoes of this episode is with Rick and Morty being trapped in a game of Roy, with Rick trying to get himself and all the splintered pieces of Morty out. Not much really happens in this episode though. There's some pretty good moments, but honestly, a lot of the episode is just pretty bland. It's got its fair share of decent jokes, but the plot is just way thinner than the previous episode, so there isn't really a lot to talk about. The episode mainly shows Rick going around trying to get Mortys to understand they need to leave, and the obvious antics and issues that come with it. Pretty whatever episode in my opinion, 5 out of 10. Oh boy, time for the apparently now obligatory incest episode of the season. How fun! Yeah, so episode 3, Bethic Twinstinct, focuses on the two Beths seemingly falling for one another in a romantic and intimate sense. It's literally the whole focus of the episode, and it's just not my cup of tea. It's not deep, it's not introspective, it's not a dive into the secret egomania of Beth Smith. And it most certainly doesn't get incest right. What the hell? Anyway, incest as a plot device and setup for jokes has become weirdly common in the last 2 seasons, and well, I just don't care for it much. It's gross. I don't need to explain why it is. At least, I hope I don't have to. Worst episode so far. Not funny, not clever, just weird. This part's pretty funny, though.
Okay, thank you.
Alright, another actually good episode. Night Family, an episode with a surprisingly normal name for once, is a pretty good one. Rick purchases a device that basically programs his unconscious self into doing tasks at night so he can be more productive, as well as get himself washboard abs. Obviously, the family wants in on this, and one thing leads to another. Boom, chaos ensues. Honestly, the concept of the unconscious self being a completely different person is a pretty cool idea, and I think it's well executed here. The only complaint with this episode is the part where Summer, quote, betrays them. I don't really understand what the Sleepy Summer's plan was, or how it worked, especially considering Summer was up all night. I just don't really get what happened here. Jerry being more or less the hero of this episode was also pretty great, with him using notes to talk to his other self, ending up being what saves them. Also, Jerry being so alone that he has to write letters to a different version of himself is just so sad. God, I love and pity Jerry so much. The car chase as they escape was well done as well, with some pretty great moments sprinkled in, and the climax of Rick deciding he would rather live as an unconscious being rather than simply scrape the leftovers off his dishes was hilarious. In the end, things don't quite work out for the Knight family, and they are forced to give up and wake up, ending with a great bit about the loss of the Choco Taco. I've never had one, but it sounded great. Pretty good episode, 7 out of 10. Alright, so here we are at the most recent episode. Final Desmithation? I don't know how to say that. This episode leaves me a bit conflicted. It's probably the funniest episode of the season so far, but the actual setup for the story is once again incest-focused, which is just like, why? Who on the writing staff is hiding their kink so poorly? Anyway, the plot focuses on Jerry getting a fortune cookie that turns out is destined to come true if he and Rick can't find a way to stop it. The fortune is that Jerry's gonna end up sleeping with his mom, by the way, so that's, yeah. After massacring a Panda Express, Rick and Jerry continue to the actual production factory for the fortune cookies. While sneaking around, they come to learn that Gwyneth Paltrow is the head of this organization, and for things to go her way, Jerry needs to fulfill his fortune. Rick and Jerry end up finding this weird alien monster responsible for making fortune cookies in a parallel I'm sure was inspired by Futurama. I mean, it's really not hard to see. Some action and witty antics ensue. Bang bang boom, the day is saved. This episode is mostly just good jokes and action, which makes it kinda tough to break down and talk about. Incest stuff aside, the episode is just genuinely funny. Probably the best episode of the season so far. 8 out of 10. So let's take a quick step back and see how things are stacking up. So with the power of math, if you add up the scores I've given each episode, it averages out to a 5.8 out of 10. Admittedly, episode 3 really drags that average down, but even without it, the average would still be a 6.7 out of 10. So far, this season just leaves me feeling conflicted. It definitely isn't as shaky as the start of seasons 4 and 5 were. Those were truly awful, but it still isn't quite at the same level of season 3 and 2. I can say that I'm enjoying this season more than the last two, and a lot of my issues in those episodes aren't here anymore, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. While not offensively bad, it's also not overwhelmingly good. So far, season 6 has just been extremely average. The show is capable of a lot more than this, but a lot worse than this, so that's good. While I may not be excited for the rest of the season, at the very least, I'm not dreading it. When the season comes to an end, I'll give the rest of my thoughts, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell if you don't want to miss it. Until then, I'm sirsurgenor, and I hope you have a good day. Peace.